in our public meetings. I propose we now proceed with the opening statements from Seamus to begin with, if that's okay, at the NUJ, and then from Dr. Flynn. The floor is yours, and you have 7 minutes.
Thank you, clearly, members of the committee. I'm grateful to the committee for the opportunity to discuss the proposed European Media Freedom Act. The proposed act comes at a time when media freedom is in peril on a global scale, when journalism is undermined by a lack of investment, regulatory failures to protect media diversity and plurality, and persistent attacks on journalists and media organisations aimed at inhibiting the conduct of their professional duty. And against this backdrop, the NUJ strongly favours the principle of global action to protect and defend freedom of expression. National governments alone cannot be relied upon to protect media freedom. International threats to the fundamental principle which underpin democracy must be addressed at European and indeed international level. As a mission statement, the European Media Freedom Act serves as a useful starting point, but as currently constituted, does not, in our view, adequately address the key issues which serve to undermine media freedom in Europe. The European Media Act is a landmark initiative aimed at strengthening the free and pluralistic media system and the commitment to protect journalists and editorial independence within the European Union. And we have provided you with a summary of our key concerns. It is not an exhaustive list. If the Act is to make a meaningful contribution to guaranteeing media pluralism, protecting journalists' rights, ensuring editorial independence from the impact of vested commercial and political interests, there will need to be genuine transparency regarding media ownership and cross-ownership, and an end to the reliance on soft laws and informal dialogue, a courageous approach to powerful tech giants, very timely at the moment, and a more strident approach to the independence of national regulators. From the NUJ perspective, far more needs to be done to deal with the scourge of surveillance against journalists, while we seek an unambiguous guarantee for the protection of sources as a fundamental tenet. My union has a proud track record of defending the right of journalists to protect sources of information, and the landmark Goodwin case, which is central to any discussion on this topic, was taken by the union on behalf of our member. Names like Ed Maloney, Geraldine Kennedy and Colm Keena are also linked to that issue. We have a major concern with the provision of Article 4. The protection of confidential sources of information is at the heart of journalism. The form of words deployed regarding protection of sources at Article 4 of the proposal does not correspond with the protections under Article 10 of the ECHR and the case law of the ECHR guaranteeing the rights of journalists to protect their sources. Indeed, Article 4 could be a step backward in the protection of journalistic sources. The actual provision does not guarantee the level of protection that all EU member states should already respect with regard to the protection of sources in the application of Article 10 as developed and reflected in the well-established case law of the European Court of Human Rights. We also share the view of the European Federation of Journalists that the guarantee of source protection at the level of media service providers providing and broadcasting of news and journalist content should not be less than the guarantees of source protection that can be invoked by individual journalists in application of Article 10. In other words, that media organisations as well as individual journalists should have protections. Under Article 4, there is a targeted safeguard against the deployment of spyware in devices used by media service providers or journalists, building on protections provided by Directive 2002/58/EC, the Privacy Directive, Directive 2016/684/EU, the Law Enforcement Directive, and Directive 2013/40/EU on attacks against information systems. However, the proposal should protect journalists from surveillance techniques in general and not just specifically spyware, and that's as reflected in Recital 16, Article 4(2)(c). We need to protect journalists from eavesdropping and ensure their encrypted communications remain secure from all spyware. The NUJ is also opposed to reliance on voluntary codes of best practice to protect editorial independence. The response of publishers' organisations to the proposed European Media Freedom Act is instructive. The European Press Association has described the Act as a media unfreedom act, but their concern is not at a perceived threat to editorial independence by the European Union, but to the right of publishers to dictate editorial content. In 1955, a US Democratic politician, Roger Brannigan, declared, "I never argue with a man who buys ink by the barrel." I suspect that in the coming months, as this issue is debated, there will be any arguments by owners, by men, they're usually all men, who used to buy ink by the barrel. European policy on media freedom is not just about cash transactions or the generation of profits. And on that note, we welcome the Act, but in an unoriginal sentiment, I would say a lot done, more to do. Thank you, Mayor.
Thank you very much, Seamus. And over to you now, Roderick, if you'd like to take the floor.
Thank you. So I just wanted to establish my interest and competence in this general area. So for about 7 or 8 years now, working under the auspices of the DCU Institute of Future Media, Democracy and Society, I have been principal investigator on a number of Irish European research projects, working as the Irish principal investigator, and these all relate to the European Media Freedom Act. One of these, probably the best known, is the Media Pluralism Monitor project, which directly informs the framing of the proposed Act. I have been principal investigator on the European Commission-funded and European University-led Media Pluralism Monitor since 2015. And this assesses actual and potential threats to media pluralism in Ireland under 200 separate headings. I'm also principal investigator on the BAI-funded Media Ownership Ireland website, which currently allows the public or anyone to identify at a granular level the ownership and control of Irish-based and Irish-facing print, broadcast and online media outlets. And we've also, I was literally in Salzburg last week, we've literally just commenced work on the Irish element of the Euro Media Ownership Monitor, which is led by the University of Salzburg and again funded by the European Commission. And this project adopts a deeper but sort of narrower approach to trying to understand how editorial content may be influenced, not just through direct ownership and control, but also indirectly through, for example, informal associations between media owners and non-media actors in, for example, politics, business, trade unions, civil society organisations, whatever it might be. Now, all of these projects put together illustrate just how much attention has been paid to matters of media pluralism and concentration for some time now, and how much concern there is internationally, and in particular, I suppose, at an EU level, about the manner in which the changing political, technological and economic climate in which media operate is challenging their capacity to fulfil their constitutive role in the operation of a healthy democratic polity. In considering the Act itself, many of the articles address risks to media pluralism, which our research on the Media Pluralism Monitor in Ireland have identified as particularly relevant to the local situation. I wanted to draw attention to, I think, 5 articles in particular, but we can talk about more, which I think will require some significant legislative and regulatory change in Ireland if we are to adopt the Act in its current form. First of these is Article 4, which Seamus has adverted to. This emphasises the importance of editorial independence for media service providers and insists that states shall not subject journalists to surveillance. In this regard, the fact that the update of the Communications Retention of Data Act of 2022 makes no special distinction between journalistic communications and all other forms of communications effectively means that journalists, like all other citizens, potentially remain subject to surveillance. And this has been identified as an issue in 2017 by a report by former Justice John Murray, and has not been addressed in the updating of the Act. Article 5 emphasises the need for transparent, open and non-discriminatory procedures for appointments to public service media, chief executive and board positions, so we're talking about RTE and TG Carr here. Current appointments to both of these boards are exclusively determined by the Minister of Communications, albeit partially subject to the advice of this committee with regard to 4 of those appointments. Now, I'm not suggesting that those boards are populated by political allies of the administration which has appointed them, but I can see little or no transparency in surrounding how such individuals are selected for appointment. The last set were appointed in July 2021. I can find no record of a public debate about who these people are and why they should be appointed or why they should not be appointed. And I'm not saying they shouldn't have been, just for the record. Article 6 requires that media service providers make easily accessible the names of their beneficial owners. So this is the ultimate controlling owner of a media company. Now, in practice, this data is available in Ireland in nearly all cases through the auspices of the media ownership site, which I can look after. But there is no absolute requirement in Irish law for media owners to make this information available. And in fact, not all Irish media which could be on the media ownership website are there, because I don't know. I cannot find out the information. Least ways not through kind of legitimate means, if you like. Article 21 requires that national legal systems assess media concentration on a transparent, objective, proportionate and non-discriminatory basis, which would seem to imply setting some kind of quantitative limits to market dominance within given media markets or across a number of media markets. Such limits simply are absent from Irish legislation as they stand. It has been argued by the Broadcasting Authority of Ireland as the relevant regulator that there is no objective basis for such limits and that the impact of specific media mergers on media market concentration should be considered on a case-by-case basis. While I accept the need to retain some scope for flexibilities in these matters, it is questionable whether such an essentially ad hoc approach can be compatible with admonitions in the European Media Freedom Act to be transparent, objective, proportionate and non-discriminatory. And the last one I would point to, and it's the one which we've been pointing at in the Irish Act for the last 7 years, every single year, relates to state advertising. Article 24 argues that public authorities should make annual declarations of how much money they have spent on advertising and which media service providers receive such advertising revenues. In this regard, Ireland is particularly lacking. According to Nielsen Media Research, spending by government, social and political organisations now constitute the 3rd largest category of advertising expenditure in Ireland. It's worth €69 million in 2021. COVID conditions, admittedly short-lived, saw the HSE alone become the 7th largest advertiser in Ireland in 2021. However, there is no publicly available database of how state advertising is allocated to media service providers. The data is simply not collated by government departments or public service institutions. And although there is no evidence that advertising expenditure is allocated in a discriminatory manner, nor is there evidence to the contrary, not least because we know, and this is important, not least because we know there are EU member states where state advertising is precisely deployed in this manner, which is intended to secure editorial support for the government of the day. So these are the key points I would draw to the committee's attention. Thank you.
Wow, lots of food for thought there. Okay, I'll hand over to my colleagues. I think we're working with the same rota as we did in session 1. So we will open the floor and I might go to Deputy Munster first, if that's all right.
Okay, thanks, Chair. Good afternoon to our guests. Can I start just with first question with Dr. Flynn? You flagged up that there were no limits in Irish legislation around national legal systems assessing media market concentrations. Will legislation be required to fulfil this requirement, do you think? And what would you like to see the Irish government do to address the issue, which has, I suppose, clearly been problematic for us in the past?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose in some respects we are in a healthier situation at the moment in that there is less concentration, ironically, in 2022 than there would have been, say, in 2015. But the issue hasn't gone away. So what we have at the moment is the relevant act is the 2014 Competition and Consumer Protection Act, which governs the whole section, Section 4, on media concentration. And this deploys responsibility for assessing media mergers across the Competition and Consumer Protection Authority, the Minister for Communications and the Broadcasting Authority of Ireland. all three, or maybe just the Minister and the CPCC may be kind of brought into bear. The BAI only comes in if the Minister requests it. At present, the only quantitative limit, even in a regulatory code, is in a BAI code that relates specifically to sound broadcasting services, to radio broadcasting services, which states that no single company should be allowed to own more than 25% of the total number of radio stations in the country. That number takes, so no more than a quarter of the total, that number takes no account of the nature of those individual stations. So it doesn't matter what your market is, what your audience share is, which is why we could have had we did have a situation whereby a single company, a single individual, simultaneously owned both national private broadcasters for a long time, Today FM and Radio Ireland. Whilst also owning a number of regional stations, and they had not breached the limits because the number of stations they owned was well below whatever the figure would have been. In other countries, there are limits. In Germany, for example, they have specified market share limits. I think it's something like 20%, no more than 20% of, Seamus might know better than this, of the print market can be controlled by an individual, or by a newspaper group. So yes, the short answer to your question is just yes. There was nothing to prohibit us in European law from writing this into legislation, and whilst acknowledging the BAI's points about seeking flexibility, the idea of having at least some number in there to prevent a situation, at the moment, in theory, there is no legal prohibition on one company owning everything, having 100% market dominance. Even if the number is 50%, 30%, whatever, we can debate what that might be, but there should be some number in law.
Thank you for that.
Imelda, Seamus wants to also come back to you on that. Is that okay?
Yes, please, yeah.
Support Deputy Minister, just to support Dr. Flynn on that, and to say that concentration of ownership is a very real issue in the regional press sector, and as a result of that, there is a dominant owner within I would say Mid-Leinster and Mid-West, which means that a significant number of newspapers are in the ownership of one company. We, at a minimum, would see that there should be an automatic investigation on what is called phase 2, on the editorial and diversity phases. In other words, that it shouldn't just be a market dominance issue. And we have a concern reflected in my report that the new body, which will replace the BAI, the all-singing, all-dancing body, which is going to be hugely powerful, will not have the resources to adequately, either the legal powers or the resources, to adequately interrogate that. And the result of that is that there are many offices, for instance, newspaper offices, which now have shared editors, shared editorial resources, unique. The regional media is a unique part of the landscape, the relationship between the resident editor, the resident reporters, and there are vast swathes where local democracy is suffering as a result of that, and competition law in Ireland just does not adequately address the democratic deficit that arises from that. So while it is less of an issue within the national newspaper sector, I would claim that it is a growing concern within the regional print in particular.
Okay, thank you for that, Mr. Dooley. Can I ask both Dr. Flynn and Mr. Dooley, just in relation to the provisions in the Online Safety and Media Regulation Bill, are there areas that you think are lacking? Are you satisfied that Commission Man will be independent and transparent? And can you comment on the powers proposed for the Commissioner, please?
What was the first part of the question? I couldn't quite hear it.
Are there areas that you think are lacking?
It's such a huge bill, I'm not even sure I know where to begin. I mean, one thing does kind of stand out to me. Part of what that bill does is it's supposed to transpose the 2018 update of the Audiovisual Media Services Directive. And that actually does have some comments about media concentration and ownership. There's no reference to ownership in the online safety bill. It's literally absent, and it did strike me as a notable absence at the time. That's probably the most kind of obvious one. In terms of powers, it depends on how well resourced that institution is going to be. Even when the BAI transitioned from being the Broadcasting Commission of Ireland to being the BAI, which it took on much greater responsibility. This is like 15 years ago, back at this stage. Because suddenly RTE came within its purview, as well as just the independent broadcasters, and I didn't see huge evidence at that stage that the resourcing, in terms of staff numbers at least, kind of went up in a way that I would have thought was concomitant with the new responsibilities that were placed within it. To a certain extent, it is a person power kind of question, but that remains to be seen, I suppose. It's a human resources question.
Yeah, I would agree. I think, Deputy, that there are a few issues here. The problem may not lie in the legislation, but how the word becomes flesh. In other words, you currently have a situation where the BAI has less than 40 employees. Currently, the Commission does not exist, and I think the figure might be 38 full-time posts. So the powers of the Commission are vested in the BAI. We welcome the future media report, and we welcome the provision in the budget of funding in relation to, for instance, local democracy reporters and those various schemes. But to be honest, it's a bit of a dog's dinner in that, in the absence of any structure to administer these funds, to put in place much of the recommendations of the Commission, they are being thrown into the mix of the powers of the Media Commission, but no resources, and in fact no clarity. One of the issues, for instance, arises that funding news and current affairs is specifically debarred from funding under, and correctly so, in the current thing under the Sound and Vision scheme. But funding for news and current affairs is provided for in the budget. So there's a lack of clarity around these issues. The NUJ actually favours that the Commission would have less powers and that there will be a separate training and development organisation, because I think the notion of one all-singing, all-dancing body which is responsible for regulation, for compliance, for training and development, for promotion of equality. No one body could do that. It's almost like a mini government in itself. And it does speak also to the Media Freedom Act in relation to the appointment of boards and bodies. I don't think that any one body should have that level of powers, and I also think that there hasn't always been the level of clarity around appointments to the BAI, or indeed to the regulatory bodies that are going to be involved, which are going to be really powerful and which will have huge powers, for instance, in deciding how money is allocated, what are the rules of these funding schemes. There will be no consultation with stakeholders in relation to any of that. So the problem may not so much lie in the bill itself, Deputy, but in is how it's worked through.
And actually, just if I may follow up on that, the point I made there about the manner in which people are appointed to RTE and TG Cahir, in looking at this question in the Media Pluralism Monitor, we make exactly the same point about the appointments to the BAI. Again, I'm not suggesting that these are political sort of apparatchiks are exclusively populating them, but it's entirely a political appointment, and there are other ways of doing this, But at the very least, there could be a kind of a discussion, perhaps within the confines of this committee, when candidates are brought forward, and kind of, well, who are these people, just so we know, is there any kind of potential issues here? It is kind of surprising to me that we don't do this, because we do this differently in other European countries. Case in point, I was in Salzburg last week in Austria. They have 36 people, which is a lot of people, admittedly, on their equivalent of RTE, ORF. But civil society groups, trade unions, universities, arts organisations, they are all allowed to nominate individuals. The Automobile Association in Austria, because it's a very powerful group, has a representative on it. So there are ways of doing it that brings it, that, if you like, dilutes the kind of the focus on exclusively political appointees or appointments.
Okay, thank you for that. It's very interesting. Do you think that the recommendation of the Future Media Commission around changing the licence fee should have been accepted by government?
Absolutely. I think that the rejection of that was an act of not just folly but cowardice, and I feel very strongly, I reject the argument that in some way it is political, it opened up the way for political interference. My view is the lack of funding and the lack of action on licence, the collection of licence, in itself is a form of political interference, because political indifference or political inaction has had consequences. So I actually was a bit confused by the concept of appointing a commission. I absolutely accept that you don't have to accept all of the recommendations, but you appoint a commission of experts to do a job. They make a recommendation, a key recommendation, and the response is to appoint a committee of experts to look at to find an alternative recommendation to the committee recommendation. I thought we kind of entered into Alice in Wonderland territory on that one, and I think the problem with it is that every day that there's a delay brings uncertainty in relation to the prospect of public service, the development of public service broadcasting in this country. There's a lot in the Commission report. There's a lot of very positive developments. It's a very useful framework. But on that issue, on the issue of public service broadcasting, it was a significant disappointment. I also think that it's disappointing that government wouldn't have confidence in its own ability to put in transparent structures to ensure that there's not interference. And, you know, interference can take many forms.
Yeah, I was just going to say there, Mr. Dooley, you'd have no fears then in terms of the Commission's recommendation for exchequer funding, in terms of how it would work in Ireland, and even, you know, that there would be trust, I suppose, the government that the editorial independence would be protected. You'd have no fears around that at all.
Well, I think you can put in, you know, there are various models throughout Europe which actually prevents interference. The reality is RTE and TG Cahir at the moment are dependent on state funding, are depending on state support, and while, you know, depending on where you sit on a political party at any given time, people will say that there is interference. But I would have to say that the current funding system has not resulted in interference. At the end of the day, you know, the choice here is the protection of public service broadcasting with all of the values that's involved. Government has a right to demand that independence criteria are met, all of the clauses. But I think the real guarantee of independence is financial viability, and that is the challenge that I see at the moment. And, you know, the Media Freedom Act does stress the importance of the protection of public service broadcasting. And also this committee, while it's a national committee, obviously has a European remit as well. And I think what we have to look at is that this Act seeks to protect the principles of public service broadcasting, which is hugely under threat in other European states, and which is a bulwark against totalitarian regimes. So I think that, you know, in looking at this naturally from a parochial interest or national interest, we must also look at the ability of this Act to protect democracies within Europe.
I mean, I would agree. I thought just briefly, it was baffling to me that recommendation was not followed. It has been recommended, I think, for 13 years by various committees, including this committee back in 2015, the introduction of a household broadcasting charge. I've heard no remotely rational reason why one would not get rid of the licence fee, which is a 20th century concept. It bears no relationship to current modes of consumption and delivery. I mean, look, we changed the licence fee system back in 2002. I think it was Dermot Ahern. And two things happened. Finally, RTE got an increase in the licence fee that sort of brought it close to kind of European norms. But they also introduced the idea that it would be index linked, subject to the consent of the minister. And between 2002 and 2008, there were a number of licence fees which saw it go to €160, where it still is 14 years on. This is bewildering to me. I mean, we talk about this with my colleagues, and we have this kind of what? And I hear the kind of the political rationale that in the wake of the furore over water charges, over local property tax, that this would feel like one more additional tax if it was done in the mechanism of a household broadcasting charge. I do not understand that argument. It is not a new tax. It is the same level as the licence fee. It would be left at €160. Who could possibly complain at exactly the same system, the same price? And as for the point about political interference, that's a very valid point, and there are certainly European countries where this is a concern. But if you take the index linking thing out of the subject to the approval of the minister, make it absolutely automatic, then there is no scope for political interference.
Okay, thanks, Chair. I think I've gone over my time there.
Okay, no problem, Amanda. Annie, the floor is yours. You have 7 minutes, or longer if you need it.
Yeah, this is a fairly hefty piece of legislation, and I'm not afraid to say that I've kind of struggled to parse through it and not conceptualise. That's the wrong word, but I found it very hard to work my way through it. I'm just wondering. You mentioned the phrase "all singing, all dancing" commission. If you were to structure it differently, what do you think would be the ideal structure as opposed to this one monolith, all singing, dancing structure? Like, is there? And to both of you, is there an international examples of how it's better,
First of all, I would agree with you in relation to the European Media Bill. There is what I might call a high fog density, but that's inevitable, and it's at a very early stage. And it has to go to the European Parliament. It's not even certain at the moment what committee it will go through. We've been relying on legal advice, European legal advice, working with the European Federation of Journalists. So I don't think, this is going to be a slow burner. It's going to take some time. In terms of the domestic situation, the European the Media Commission in Ireland, my concern actually is that it won't have the editor. The Commission will not have the. We will not have the sufficient resources to do all of the jobs that is recharged properly. The budget, which is by and large fairly positive, and the Commission report dovetail reasonably well. Most of them, there are a lot of measures like the Democracy Reporter Scheme, court reporting. They protect public interest journalism. And going back to Deputy Munster's point, there was some concern, would that be politicised? But I trust ourselves as a state that we should be able in a modern republic to trust ourselves to put in place structures like that. But I think that there is a benefit in having, what I would do is I would remove the administration of the Sound and Vision Fund, I would admit the local democracy funding, training, the promotion of gender into a media training and development agency, which would be separate, because I think that no one body can do that. And I think there's also, I'm nervous that the same body that decides who gets the money for training and development, who allocates funds, and there's no structure, no indication as to what role there would be for the NUJ, or there's been no consultation with industry in relation to any of this. I have a concern that the same body that has all of that powerful grant-giving bodies has the power to decide who gets a licence for a radio station, has the power to decide who is allowed to buy other radio stations, has the power to investigate media mergers. I actually don't believe that one body should have all of that power. I think that they also don't have, and that's not, I have huge respect for the personnel within the BAI, but I don't believe that any one body has the capacity or the competence to do that. But I also think that vesting at that level of power is a concern, and I don't think it reflects the spirit of some what's in the BAI. Dr. Flynn may have a different view.
It's a really good question, and I wish I had a really neat answer. So, the BAI is a regulator, and it's also a funder as things stand. And the future of Media Commission, how it envisages the new commission, sees that basically being extended, but it's been extended in a way which is much more problematic. So at the moment, the BAI is the administrator of the Sound and Vision Fund, which is, 7% of the licence fee is top sliced. given to the BAI to in turn distribute to any broadcaster on the island of Ireland who are producing public service content. And the way that that system works is that a producer puts forward an application that says, I have a piece of content either for radio or for TV, and is this worthy of getting funding? And actually, I mean, it's done some really good work. TG Cahir probably relied on it for quite a long time. It's put some great work into Irish cinema, actually, as a matter of fact. You enter a slightly different realm when you talk about a body that might be funding news and current affairs, however, which the BAI Sound and Vision Fund has been, as Seamus points out, prohibited from doing up to this stage. And it brings up two issues. One, a practical one. News and current affairs works on a kind of 24-hour cycle. You can't have kind of journalists wandering in going, is it okay to do this story and will you fund it? That's not, it's going to have to be a completely different system. And secondly, the nature of the content is different. It's more, politically significant on a day-to-day basis. So in that context, whilst, I should state a kind of an interest here. I have been employed as a consultant to assess the Sound and Vision Scheme in the past. And so we talked to recipients, producers, and they're broadly happy actually with the idea that the BAI would administer the Sound and Vision Scheme. And it was specifically suggested that perhaps Screen Ireland might take that over instead. And on the whole, producers said, no, we would prefer it was stayed with the BAI. It gives us some choices, basically. If Screen Ireland say no, maybe the BAI will say yes. But it is a different situation when you come to news and current affairs. And there I do think you're talking about an independent body, all right. What that is, I don't know. Maybe a media training body would be it. But it does seem... The scope for conflict of interest seems significant here. If for no other reason than this is also the body which looks after broadcasting complaints. So a body might fund a piece of work which it then has to adjudicate on as the Complaints Commission. This seems very problematic. So I would take that particular aspect out of it and set it up separately. Nonetheless, we are where we are, I suspect, for right now. Right?
Yeah, when you say it like that, it does seem somewhat both overarching, a little too all-encompassing and very ripe, or not ripe, but great possibility, as you said, for the conflict of interest. Yeah, it's actually, when you're just laying it out like that, it does seem somewhat kind of a silly proposal to you be funding.
It's a little unusual by international standards. I'm not aware of anywhere else that does it in quite this way.
It also would be the body under legislation that investigates mergers and takeovers and acquisitions by some of the body, and inevitably by some of the bodies that it would also be funding. And that would have an ongoing relationship with in that way. So you're requiring a large body in relation to that.
It seems to be an immensely powerful body. And you've said that there isn't really an international example of how it's done like this.
Well, we usually look to Anglophile countries, so we look to the FCC, we look to Ofcom, and those, the responsibilities of those institutions are enormous, but they don't usually come down to, I'm pretty certain either Ofcom nor the FCC put any funding into content production, whether it be for news and current affairs or for drama or whatever it might be. That's usually regarded as, well, in the States you don't have that kind of state funding for the most part at all. Yeah. But in the UK, that's the responsibility of the UK Film Council or something else. It's not part of Ofcom's remit.
Yeah, it would strike me at a bare minimum that at least the complaints, do you know what I mean, those extreme, not that there's sliding scales of conflicts, but that would seem to me to be almost like an extreme example of conflict where you would be adjudicating on something you would be at least at a minimum those should be separated out. Although I feel, based on what you've said, there's a opportunity for a lot more dispersing.
I've actually looked for an example of where this has happened already. It turns out it hasn't, and to some extent that might be because the nature of the material that the BAI is funded has to be public service in its nature, which tends to make it, I would safer isn't quite the term I'm looking for, but probably less likely to be controversial in its nature.
Yeah, and Senator, I suppose I would want to be positive here and say that actually many of the powers in relation to the idea of funding of public interest journalism, of broadening the base, these are all good things. And it being mired in organisational chaos would be a concern, because I think that could actually be deterrent to achieving some really laudable aims.
I mean, just one other thing on that. Like, what I really liked about the Future Media Commission report was I thought it was the first report which, it's front and centre. It's the basis of that report. It says that news and current affairs is the bedrock of democracy in Ireland. Like, not just in the abstract, but specifically in Ireland. I can't actually quite remember seeing that in an Irish report in quite such kind of blanket terms, and it builds from that. A, and then B, it says, but the funding model that has kind of supported that for about 200 years is maybe not entirely broken, but it's certainly challenged. And therefore, so those are two things. This stuff is really important, and the way that we have financially supported this up till now is not sustainable. So let's work from that basis. I mean, that's great, right? So I kind of philosophically, I like where we're at. It's maybe just how we actually figure out how we actually apply that.
Okay. I'm happy to end there if that's all right for now.
Thank
Yeah.
you very much, Jenny. So now, over to Senator Malcolm Byrne.
Thanks, Chair, and thanks to our witnesses for the presentation. I suppose to make a general comment at the start, I think the issues that we're talking about are fundamental to our democracy and to our society, around that we have a free and fair media, that we have freedom of expression. That has to be obviously balanced with responsibilities as well. So I think the principles that underpin not just our national legislation but what's happening at European level, I think we've got broadly right. Yeah. I think our arguments are very much around structure, and I suppose I want to almost challenge some of what you've been saying first, before maybe coming on to a couple of specific questions. I think you're right. I mean, if we were here, I wouldn't necessarily have started from now with Commissioner Mann in terms of its overarching responsibilities. It will be the most powerful regulator in the state, particularly when it takes on some of the responsibilities under the Digital Services Act. And I think increasingly there are going to be more regulatory responsibilities given to it. So I think, Seamus, you're correct. And certainly, I mean, in our discussions, and I know even talking with the BAI here over the last few years, they will need to move from 40 to 400 plus staff. And these are, in many cases, very specialist staff that they're going to require in a relatively short period of time. But I do think it is right that we have a powerful regulator. I mean, some of my criticisms, as colleagues here at the committee will know, is that, we possibly didn't give them enough teeth in certain areas to be able to tackle, especially on the social media side, but some of those ownership questions. So I guess my first thing is around the level of, not the resourcing, but the level of teeth that it has to take action. And then the second, I'm going to challenge you, Roderick, in terms of the appointments. Sure. To the boards, because I know both the chair and myself and the clerk will recall, I mean, the appointments to the board of RT, and I know in the case of our colleagues in the Cushton and Gaelga here with regard to TG Carr, it came through the Public Appointment Service. There was, a shortlisting process, an interview process, and so on. So it was very open and transparent. And indeed, I think if I'm correct, the clerk can correct me on this, I think there were 52 applicants in the case of the 4 appointments to RT. So that was a quite open process. I'm not quite certain that I move, as I know happens in other jurisdictions, to the idea that we kind of have people here, and like say with the FCC, and interview them in a public fashion, and whether we could go down, that role. I do think with regard to the new commissioners, they are accountable to the PAC for the expenditure of finance, but I think there is certainly a case around, on some of their decisions. So maybe I might just touch on some of those issues first before I might go into some specific questions, and if you've a response to the arguments I've made.
Okay, just on the PSM appointments, I'm not saying there isn't a process, and I'm aware that there's they have to go through the process. I went back through the minutes of this committee for a couple of years just to see had there ever been any mention of the subject. The process is not public in the sense, if I can't, this is what I do for a living, if I can't find out what criteria, what questions were asked of those individuals, then who can? Where would I? I mean, and I asked this actually.
Well, there was a booklet published as part of the advertising process.
Okay, there's the criteria. So, and then when we actually come to the process of the specific individuals, how do I find out what went on kind of in those, like, why was this person kind of allocated the position over the other? As you say, there were 52 candidates. I'm not here's the thing about we've sometimes forgotten actually about the people who are appointed to BSM boards. De facto, there is a degree of the people who are appointed to the boards of the TGCAR and RTE historically have ended up sort of becoming defenders of those institutions. That's the polar opposite of what they're meant to be. They're meant to defend the public interest, in a way against the threat that those institutions might step out of line. I think I would be really interested to know what kind of criteria that those individuals who were appointed to the boards might bring to bear in those kind of conversations. I don't have any way of knowing how that would work or what they might think. I don't really know now. I mean, I can Google the individuals. I've done that. It still doesn't tell me very much of what I might expect to hear from them about, for example, protecting the public interest in the I suspect relatively unlikely situation that kind of RTE or TGCAR just goes off the wall, right, and kind of starts acting in a way which is manifestly contrary to public interest. So, in some respects, I'm in heated agreement with you about things. For example, you mentioned about the regulator having teeth. Absolutely, I'm on board with this. I also do accept that there is a process. I just think that the process is not very transparent, actually, and not public. Saying this is the criteria that we will be seeking does not tell me why these particular individuals were appointed.
I just come in on that. I'm not opposed to a powerful regulator at all. My concern actually is that they're going to have so much to do that they may not be powerful enough, in some areas, and that actually being powerful but having more focused power, if that makes sense, would be a better way of doing it. And also, I mean, you mentioned rightly, Senator, the issue around the Digital Services Directive, and you mentioned the issue of regulation. The largest department will be the legal department, and they will be regulating bodies, international companies, some of whom have budgets far in excess, not just of the Commission, but in some cases probably the Irish government. So actually, and they're going to be doing that in their spare time, in between advising on media mergers and funding and all sorts of other things. So that's my concern. In relation to the issue of appointments and transparency, I don't have a difficulty with public hearings for the chairs of public bodies. There's a new chair about to be appointed to RTE. That will have the chair that has an influence on public service, public policy in Ireland. And I'm relying only on Phoenix Magazine, for who might or might not be published, who might get that chair. I absolutely have no difficulty.
If that's your source, I wouldn't always rely on it, I think.
I'm slightly tongue-in-cheek. Yeah. I still think they should get the VAT exemption. But the reality is that I don't have a difficulty with a public hearing for the chairmanship of some public bodies, or the chair of some public bodies. Because I know the concern that there might be a deterrent for suitable applicants to apply, but actually there's a balance to be struck there. The role of the chair of these bodies, the potential for the power that they exercise is such that I actually think the public does have a right to know, and I think that greater public hearing would probably be a good idea. But I absolutely appreciate where you're coming from in terms of that you also want to make sure that people are not inhibited from it.
I think our committee has, and it's been quite proactive. Like, we've had the chair of RT, we've had the chair of the BAI.
I'm saying prior to
the.
Yeah.
No, I get the point. If I can, because just constant time, a couple of quick questions to throw, which is, I suppose, that general question around, I am going to, but we'll disagree on the question of the experts on the Commission on the Future Media report, I mean, government did accept 45 of the 50 recommendations. It's up to government to make decisions, whether you agree with them or not, but it's government that makes decisions. And we can argue back and forward about the model that's going to be used, but it does lead me to the question around whether you believe it would be more appropriate that RTE should look at becoming a publisher-broadcaster model, and that may be more effective also in terms of accountability on its finance side, rather than its existing model.
Yeah, I've given this some thought. Okay, rather than maybe just thinking in terms of the kind of the publisher-broadcaster model, here's another model. And I haven't worked the maths of this through, and maybe RTE, as soon as they hear this, will go, sweet Lord, let him not speak any further. But imagine a world where RTE was told, as TV3 asked back in 1998, that RTE can no longer have commercial funding, but that RTE was given exclusive access to a properly gathered public source of funding. Right? So let's say a household broadcasting charge, for example. Now, I did bother doing the maths on this and kind of try to figure out what this would mean for RTE. And the back of the envelope estimate is RTE would take, in a properly collated or collected situation, about 250 million, about $250 million kind of per year. Now imagine RTE isn't thinking like a commercial broadcaster as well as a public service broadcaster, as it at the moment has to do. Right? That would probably mean it stops doing some of the things that it does now that we think of as fundamental to its identity. It probably means it stops going after large sporting events, for example, which might be a terrifying kind of concept. But those large sporting events are going to be made available on a free-to-air basis, A, because they are protected under the 2003 Broadcasting Amendment Act, and because other broadcasters are going to want them, there's going to be demand for them. So that would mean that RTE would probably focus on news and current affairs. This would be perhaps, I argue, its specific mandate. It would go into drama, which is expensive, and like local drama, and is sometimes hard to kind of financially kind of recoup those resources from the local market. Children's content, kind of more broadly, and say arts and culture. Right, so it becomes not so much. It becomes something a bit more like
BBC Two
or Radio 4 or something. I mean, I don't want to hold these up as kind of as absolute models, but something a bit more like that. This then leaves the commercial market to the commercial players who can, basically do what they will in that space.
I look forward to when RTE are before us in a few weeks to hearing their response to.
I mean, this is kind of if I was king, right? Kind of this is what I would do and sort of see what happened. But there may be kind of financial considerations that I'm simply unaware of in this respect. But why not let the public service broadcaster just be a public service broadcaster?
I'm firmly wedded to the concept of public service broadcasting, and one way of looking at the alternative is to say that RTE do what is perceived to be important in the public interest, i.e. the boring bits, and the commercial sharks owned by investment companies and all the rest do the profitable bits. And I think there's a danger there. I think that the remit of RTE goes way just beyond news and current affairs, and I think that the powers, and I think the stuff like the language, culture, the orchestras, drama, archives, that work is really important, and I think funding RTE to ensure that all that survives is really important. And I think if you dismantle public service broadcasting, you won't miss it until it's not there.
Can I, Chair, and two final questions on that broader question of media freedom. So part of, I think, our challenge, particularly in the new, very diverse media environment we exist, around questions around media literacy and how that's going to be addressed. I would argue that there's a responsibility on media outlets as much as on the education system, and just on your views as to how we can enhance media and separately digital literacy. And then finally, to touch on it, while there is obviously the challenge of ensuring, fact-based news and so on, but there is a challenge around our defamation laws. It's been a long time coming that they do need to be reformed. You might speak more generally to it, but also indeed to the question of politicians who look to take legal cases against media outlets and whether that has a chilling impact on those media outlets.
Well, in relation to literacy first, I agree with you. I think media literacy is enormously important. I think one of the issues the NUJ published a news recovery plan, and one of the issues we talked about was a levy on tech giants. And I think that I know their financial position is viewed as being precarious now, but one precariety in that situation is a matter of perspective, isn't it? But I do actually think that the issue of how that funding would come through, I think, is important. I don't think it can be just left it can be left to the education system. I think it is important that people differentiate between social media gossip and informed news and current affairs, and people need to be educated, and there needs to be a clarity around what is independent verifiable facts and what is the equivalent of what used to be a late night discussion in a pub. So I think that that's a very basic definition of media literacy, but I agree with you. The defamation laws are chilling. Every citizen has a right to use them. I have always been opposed to both politicians and journalists using defamation law where there are alternative mechanisms for doing so. I think that defamation law were designed originally as a platform for people who effectively had no other way of seeking redress. Every citizen has a right to their good name, to their good reputation. And I think it would be very wrong to say that because one stands for elected office or because one has a public profile that you cannot use the defamation law. But at the same time, I would prefer that those who play a public role would use other means of complaint. If I were a politician, I think that I would, in the first instance, seek the right of redress of the Press Council. I think that in the case of print, and I think that is the appropriate way. But you can't, in a democracy, make that compulsory, and you can't say that because one has a public profile that they can't exercise a right that other people have. It's not, however, compulsory. Having said that, no one has a right to automatically appear on a radio station or on a television. No one has a right to, no one has a right to promote themselves. So I would be careful about getting too excited on the basis of individual incidents. I say that as someone who was dropped from the Sunday Independent, where there was going to be an expose of my expenses, but they were so poor that they weren't worth exposing.
On media literacy, this is something that we look at in the Media Pluralism Monitor, and our general assessment is that Ireland has still a kind of a nascent policy in general in this regard. I have two Leaving Cert or kind of secondary school kind of kids, and I have conversations with them, and it's kind of apparent that it's somewhat reliant. It's not fundamentally kind of built into the curriculum at the moment. It really kind of depends on, do you have a teacher who's kind of interested in doing this? I'm not saying there isn't media literacy, and it certainly is a junior cert level, but it's not kind of that in depth. And at senior cert level, it's possible to just do kind of traditional, poetry and prose and whatever, and go through English, having never looked at a film. So it's increasingly unlikely, but it is still possible. And one of the concerns I also have is that there's a tendency to treat media, because it's been done through the prism of English. It's that thing of, to a person with a hammer, everything looks like a nail. They treat it as a kind of a written text, not as a visual text. And so I think we haven't quite reached that stage yet. As for literacy and kind of broader kind of social media, that's still very much kind of at a nascent level. And my feeling is that this is something that is a curriculum development issue, but it's an urgent one because this is their reality, especially for younger kids. And I mean, I say this kind of their reality, and some of those kids are now in their 20s and 30s, you know, because we've had the Facebooks of this world for 50
Could I say
years.
kids are often far more attuned to the digital reality than maybe older generations?
They're certainly far more defined by it. I mean, I remember 20 years ago we had this kind of thing in the School of Communications at DCU that our new students were going to be digital natives and they'd know more than us about kind of media and stuff. That turned out kind of not to be true, because ironically the more invisible the interface became, the less understanding there was of what lay behind it, you know, so they don't see the code, if you like. But it's where they live, right? They live kind of online. As for defamation laws, look, they're chilling. I mean, we have external kind of European Court of Justice confirmation of this, the Indo versus Monica Leach case that took, 8 years, I think, to finally get to the European Court. The European Court came back and said, look, Irish defamation laws as they stand are a problem, because there is essentially no limit on the amount that might be awarded in the case of a successful defamation action. Now, the single largest defamation action in Ireland actually doesn't relate to a newspaper, but the Leach case, you know, was interesting. I think the original award was 1.25 million, or was it even more? Was it knocked down to 1.25 million by the Supreme Court? So it might have started at 1.65 million. You know, that's enough to close some newspapers. Certainly, it was a regional title. You'd be out. And I mean, there has been kind of quite a bit of discussion about this. There are kind of some fairly obvious recommendations that it should be entirely taken out of the responsibility of a jury to make this allocation, so it should be left to judges. There has been some improvement in that judges now make recommendations to juries about the kind of the appropriate level of an award. But it would appear to me that the only kind of sane way forward actually is to leave it entirely to judges and to have a very clearly defined set of criteria about, you know, this is how much money this is worth. So.
If you are all happy, colleagues, that concludes our business today. I want to thank our witnesses for being with us today. I think it's been a great learning curve for us all, and thank you for your time and effort you put into your own presentations. We very much appreciate that. I want to thank the clerk and all the staff here too for making everything run so seamlessly. And just to say that concludes our business for today. The meeting is now adjourned, and the committee's next meeting takes place on Wednesday the 23rd of November at 11:30, when we